interesting. Well, let's dive in. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do want to talk about vinyl. I want to talk about what's happening today with vinyl. And you've written and contributed to so much in the world of music and artists and record labels, like our friends at Sub Pop, who we've had on the show here.
Good.
And then your new book that you've contributed to, In the Groove, the Vinyl Record and Turntable Revolution, which I'm sure some of our listeners and our viewers maybe got for Christmas this year, because I saw it on a lot of end caps in the music stores here in Canada. So I'm sure a lot of people picked it up. Let me ask you this question to get started. All of us are kind of born at various different times in this short life of recorded music. And we all have our different entry points into becoming a fan or becoming a collector. Can you share your early memories of recorded music? Like what it was that captivated you? Was it the artwork? Was it the environment or the smell of taking the cellophane off? What were your early memories of holding something in your hands?
Well, I definitely grew up with vinyl because that was pretty much all there was. I know my dad did have a reel-to-reel tape deck, and my mother had said that at one point he had persuaded her to record all their albums on this reel-to-reel tape because, then you didn't have to keep the albums. It was easier to store it and such. But then, over the years, the oxide of the tape flakes off. So then, she you lose all your music. So
yeah.
It's always degeneration to worry about. But I mean, so when I grew up, it was mainly vinyl.
Yeah.
Not singles so much. For a long time, I wasn't really that interested in singles because in America anyway, the single is on the album. So if you're buying the album, why would you buy the single? And yes, the album costs more, of course, but then it's better value for money because you get songs. So I really didn't buy albums that much. And then I do remember when the next format came in, recording tape, which I mentioned the reel to reel, but that was more of an esoteric thing. That wasn't the standard thing you'd find in most homes.
Sure.
But then cassette and 8-track came in. And so there was that kind of vying for which was going to be the dominant one. And I preferred cassettes because they didn't have that thing when you're on 8-track, especially in the middle of a song. I mean, this is one funny memory that sticks in my mind. And this would have been in, let's see, I don't know, the 80s, maybe the early 90s when I was working at the Rocket magazine in Seattle. And the art director had brought in this sort of huge component stereo system, the kind that came in, it looked like a table in itself, long and wooden and everything. And it had an 8-track deck. So he would pick up all kinds of 8-tracks, which were dirt cheap then. Well, they probably still are, I suppose.
Sure.
But that was when, cassettes were the dominant one. So 8-tracks, you couldn't give them away. But one night I was there with one of the editors. We were working on our stuff. And so you turn up the music loud because the office is closed. It's just you up there. And there was an 8-track of the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Okay.
And we're listening to that. And the Time Warp is playing. And then all of a sudden it starts to fade out. And I thought, wait a minute, that's only the first verse. What's going on? And then we heard this ka-chung, and then it changes and it fades right back up. So,
right.
Right in the middle of the song. And the editor was in another room, but we both just cracked up.
Oh, yes. I've heard of that limitation. I don't have too much experience with 8-tracks. My grandparents, I would play them, but I heard recently of that time limit on them. That's so hilarious. No wonder they didn't last.
And they didn't program it right. Plus, they were always jamming in the machines. They didn't seem like a good medium.
Yeah.
But certainly as a child, my parents it was mostly albums. I don't really remember them having 45s much at all. A few 78s. And certainly when I was very young, I wasn't allowed to touch them or play them. Adults had to operate this kind of thing. And there was they had the album Frankie Yankovic's Greatest Hits.
Okay.
And there was a song on that called Who Stole the Kishka, which is a really great, rousing song. And they're going, yip, yip, throughout. And that just really excited me as a child. But, I couldn't play it myself. So you had to wait. for
Wow.
them to play it.
Yeah.
And so there was just that you couldn't touch it, so you didn't have it available all the time. And now I have that song, and I can listen to Who Stole the Kishka whenever I want.
Whenever you want. What a rebel. And that's such a cool memory, because that type of patience is, I mean, something we don't have. We don't have to have it today. We don't, and kids today have no concept of waiting for something. And I mean, it's, for me, it's always been, for you, it was waiting for your parents to allow you to put on that song. Or for me, it was waiting on the radio for that song to come on, and hopefully I could hit record.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then when MP3s came along when I was in high school, it was waiting to download a song, waiting for 3 hours for that one download to come in. So it's always a waiting game for a long time.
Yeah. I remember. So let's see, when would this have been? I guess late 70s, early 80s, when you started learning about imports, and that the same record that came out in another country might not be the same track listing, or it would sound different.
Yeah.
Like those first two Clash albums, they had just had a completely different running order. So, trying to track those down, and you'd have to send off for them and hope that your letter arrived, and then hope that the package came back. And if it was going overseas, to England, that could take months.
And you're sending a money order or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to figure out how to send it in different currency. And that's why when you traveled, and I remember a friend telling me this, where he was coming home from England one time, and he had so many albums when he came home. Customs was grilling him about that, because they were thinking, is this a business you're running? And he's, no, I'm just a music fan. And, I wasn't grilled by customs agents because I didn't bring that many records back. But yeah, I certainly would pick up things in England, and you had to carry them with you because you couldn't get a box to check them like a suitcase, and they might get broken. So
yeah, that's so interesting. Talk to me real quick about the concept of the album, because you had referred to the fact that there were singles available. And if we do trace this back to, and we can talk about this a little bit, for as much as you and I know about the 12-inch and the 7-inch. But I had read, and this was something that was talked about a lot in the 2000s when they came out with MP3s, they called it the death of the album. And I'm not talking about any sort of format, but it's just that idea of a collection of songs in whether it's a cohesive collection of songs like Frank Sinatra, or if it's a compilation. I loved that image of it going all the way back to single 78s in a photo album, literally a photo album. And that's where we get that. I'm curious, because you said that you were more interested in albums. There was an accusation back then, and in the book, and an accusation in the 2000s, that there was a lot of filler on those albums, that you would have the A-sides, you'd have the big songs, and then everything else was filler. I just find that hard to believe in the 90s and 2000s, and I find it hard to believe in the 70s and 60s as well, that an artist would allow for quote-unquote filler, or that they would even write filler. What do you know about that?
Oh, well, I think the idea of filler on albums is more we think of in the pop genre, and acts that were considered to not be around very long. And you said something really interesting that kind of it also explains a lot of it. You said, why would they write filler? Well, a lot of these artists didn't write songs at all.
Sure.
That wasn't necessarily the standard. I'm writing a thing now about the Meet the Beatles album coming out in America, and just how it's different from the UK version. And there's only one cover on there. And I point out, this was as important a thing about the Beatles as their music, the fact that they wrote all their own songs.
Right.
And certainly there were some artists in the rock era that wrote their own songs. You think about, the early rockers like Chuck Berry mostly wrote his songs. But, Jerry Lee and Little Richard didn't necessarily write them.
Sure.
The Beach Boys, or mainly Brian Wilson, wrote their songs. But still, it was pretty common for an artist to just rely on professional songwriters.
That's right. Yeah.
So that was so these artists that on these albums were not, writing their own stuff, and certainly with stuff especially aimed at the teen market. And in this country, where you'd have a single on an album, they figure, the kids are going to buy the album because of the hit singles, right. So we don't have to care about the rest of the stuff. So it was just to fill it out so they could sell this higher price thing. I'm sure that, once you got to someone of the stature of a Sinatra, say, is by that point in his career, by the 50s and 60s, when long players are becoming more of the standard, someone like him, he could say, no, I'm not going to record that song because he's Frank Sinatra.
That's right.
Or a well-known established act would probably have more say. But a new act, especially, a young pop band, would not have that pull. So, yeah, they'd kind of be forced to do that. And if you look at a lot of biographies of the Beatles, they point out that one thing about them was that all their albums as a whole were good, because it wasn't just the popular song and then filler. So, they were quality. And then finally, by the time of Rubber Soul, where their writing had become more sophisticated, that's really, I think, when you get the idea of an album, a rock album anyway, or being a piece of art. It doesn't have to be just a random collection of things. They can all be good songs, and maybe they can all have a theme, or not concept album per se, but just of the same type of song.
Well, that's so interesting, and you're right. That timeline does really line up, where other people would start to try to aim for, whether it was Pet Sounds or whatever album that would come after that, and they would aim for a cohesive vision. The thing that a lot of songwriters still try to aim for today. And I was always offended when people said that the MP3s or streaming, the fact that you could take songs a la carte and make your own albums or your own playlists. I was always offended by that, but all music fans would want to do that, and that artists would want their musics chopped apart, because I'm still extremely passionate at making full-length albums as an artist and enjoying full-length albums as a music fan.
Yeah, I know sometimes I'll read, I keep bringing up the Beatles, but
that's okay.
People saying, yeah, when I listen to such and such an album, I always skip over this song.
Right.
I hear that most in talking about the Beatles, but you read that with other things too.
Oh, sure.
And if I'm playing an album, I don't skip over the songs, because I just see it as a complete work.
Yeah.
Sometimes if I just want to hear one song,
sure,
then, I'll listen to that, or you're changing the CDs or whatever to hear the one song. But if I put an album on, I just play it all the way through.
Of course, yeah, and I mean the idea of skipping on vinyl is much harder to do than on a CD.
Yeah.
We're going to be all over the place here, and I hope that's okay. So we're going to kind of like hop over decades and back and forth. But I want to, what's so fascinating to me in the book, in the first chapter, alludes to this, the idea that the original lifespan of vinyl was maybe only a quarter century. I mean, just from invention to when people started to talk about cassettes, and so I find it so interesting. We're maybe only 100 years into this recorded music experiment, and we have vinyl, and then we have and all the different types of vinyl and acetate. And then we have cassettes and popularity of cassettes and 8-tracks attempting that. And everybody gets like 10, 20 years in the sun until the next one comes along, the CD comes along, and then iTunes and MP3s comes along, and then they only had 10 or 15 years until streaming. The part of the story that's so interesting that we have yet to see is one of those formats, namely vinyl, coming back to life. Mm-hmm. And I just find that really, really fascinating. Have you given much thought to why that is? I mean, it's seemingly unprecedented. It's not to say it's not going to happen again with CDs or tapes, but I just find that part of the story so fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've wondered about why vinyl has come back. I know in my chapter, I point some of the turnaround to the start of Record Store Day and sort of spotlighting vinyl and trying to get people back into the stores where you'd buy a physical product. But when you were listing all those formats, I started thinking that one reason those formats all came along after vinyl is that they were all about portability, being able to take your music with you. I mean, first you had tapes, and so you'd put a tape player in your car. And then they had the Walkman, so you could hear the tape when you were walking around. And so every other format has been like that. The CDs came along, and again, in the car or the CD player, and even with the MP3s and the streaming too. You can get something in your car to stream if you can get a connection, which that's the flaw in that system. But also, I think you can download MP3s on a player and take them around. Well, heck, I bought an MP3 player for when I go to the dentist. Just plug in.
Yeah, that's right. It never overpowers what they're doing in your teeth, though. I can still hear it.
Yeah, but it's a bit of a distraction.
That's a good point. I should try that.
I was thinking about this today in advance of the interview and wondering, and I haven't talked to a younger person about this or read this, so I don't know, but I grew up with vinyl, as I said, so I saw those things, and I just wonder if part of it might be the novelty factor of seeing a 12-inch album, in its big folder. They didn't grow up like that, so maybe there's something kind of exotic about it because it wasn't part of the way they grew up, and they realized, wow, just having something that big you could hold.
Well, I think
I put that in my chapter on record stores, where I said when the MP3s and streaming came along, that was the first sound format that you couldn't actually hold. You can't hold the MP3. For sure. Hold the device that it's on or that you download it or whatever, but you can't hold it. And obviously streaming. Although streaming, that's what we used to call listening to the radio.
Oh, but there was something more, the lack of control was more alluring. I think the word portability, and I talk about vinyl and I talk about formats and marketing and sales on this show every single week. And the term portability has not been an argument I've heard before. And I really like it. And I think you're onto something because vinyl is the least practical out of all of them. Yeah. And so because I do have a question here about, is the inevitable revolution, is it inevitable we'll see a revolution in CDs or cassettes? And I know there's cassette subcultures out there. And for me, I was born in 83. So everything that I started with was cassettes. And I've since replaced all of my childhood cassettes. I've gotten them back. And they're in my living room. And I listened to one this morning. I listened to them a lot. There is a insanely close visceral connection to my childhood through these cassettes that I don't have with vinyl. At the same time, I have more vinyl. I buy more vinyl. I'm obsessed more with vinyl. But I just want to say that this idea of portability, that all of those other formats were about convenience to where we get to the absolute ultimate, so far, the ultimate convenience, which is right now, I can just say an album name and it'll start playing. And so, yeah, I like that a lot. Do you think that's an argument for why maybe we won't see the same type of revolution for CDs or cassettes? And I won't hold you to this. I won't take this out as a soundbite in 10 years from now. But do you think that's an argument as to maybe why we may not see that same revolution?
Well, I think the convenience of things you download or stream will always be there. I guess one thing I find kind of frustrating is that people tend to talk in terms of a format beating out another format. And I'm more likely to think, why can't they just coexist?
Good for you.
Like with books, when ebooks came out, they said, oh, this will be the death of the physical book.
Yeah.
And it actually hasn't been at all. And
the opposite.
They said that, that ebooks peaked and then they don't sell as much.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly they could have their practical advantages. You get a Kindle or whatever the other readers are. And if you're going on vacation or if you're a student, say, instead of buying all those textbooks, you just have them all on this device. Yes. But at the same time, books have their value too. I saw an interview with Jeff Bezos where he'd said how, the book was the most perfect form of technology. But then there's the next sentence was something like, and I want to outdo it or outperform it or get rid of it. Well, if you think it's so great, why do you want to get rid of it?
Yeah.
Which, it is. I mean, because you don't need anything except light. So So if you don't have electricity, you just wait for the sun to come up,
Yeah.
and you can read.
Yeah.
And I wonder sometimes I think about this with books, but it would be just as true with music too. Well, maybe not quite because of the difficulty of finding a player, but maybe you have a book that your grandmother gave you, and you treasure that because it's something that your grandmother owned. Your grandmother's book gave it to your mother gave it to you. So it's like this family thing, and it has that sentimental value. And just having music available through streaming and such, you don't have that kind of sentimental connection. So certainly the convenience of having that's going to be there. But I think people may also just, have a lure for a fondness for physical media too, even if it doesn't match that. I think there's also the practical element, the practical side of that too. I've seen this, and this was talking about movies. I was on Facebook in some group I'm in, the Rocky Horror Picture Show group, and someone said, Rocky isn't streaming on Hulu anymore. Where can I see it? And so a couple of us chimed in and said, that's why we have the DVD. Someone came in to my place once, and they're looking at all my books and said, why don't you just get rid of all this and you can read it all online? And when you can't, not everything is on there.
Right. Yeah.
When things are on there, then they disappear.
That's right.
And, yeah. So you mentioned speaking into your device, say, I'd like to hear such and such an album. But then what if it's not streaming anywhere?
We won't be
able to experience it.
Yeah.
So certainly if it's something I want to see a lot, or like Beatle records, or if it's something I want to own, it's something I know I'm going to want to listen to over the years, like Who Stole the Kishka, then I will buy that in some physical format so that I have it.
Well,
and then when you have it, now you could pop it in I still have disk drives. You could rip it, burn it elsewhere, stream it elsewhere, but got it.
Well, you're absolutely right. And this speaks to what your first point of coexisting, and there is no, you're right. I did start this off by saying that the cassette was meant to get rid of vinyl, and that CDs were meant to get rid of tapes. And I know a lot of people who probably threw out each previous format, rebought all their favorite records, thinking it was better and so on. And even between CDs and MP3s, there was SACDs and that kind of stuff. But it does seem, in hindsight, it seems ridiculous. It seems like there are applications. I mean, I have a big vinyl collection. I listened to tapes. I listened to a cassette this morning. At the same time, of course, I've got Spotify. I've got Apple Music. I've got devices all over the place to listen to music. And so there really is something enjoyable about having all of the formats. And I don't know why we have that tendency to pit them against each other.
Well, I think part of that is marketing. They want you to buy it because they'll, especially with the music. That is one thing I guess maybe I was thinking about this more with movies. I thought, God, I hope they don't get rid of DVDs completely, because I don't want to buy it all again.
Right.
You had it on VHS.
Yeah.
DVD. At least Blu-ray players will play DVDs. So. Yeah.
I mean, those industries aren't mirroring each other exactly the same way. The book and ebook one is kind of similar versus the vinyl and digital. It is kind of interesting because a lot of people, they won't poo-poo ebooks, but they really there is a convenience on a cruise ship. You don't want to bring all of your books with you, or on a plane, but having that bookshelf at home it really means something. It's something very meaningful in the same way that records are. So yeah, who knows what's going to happen with DVDs? I heard Best Buy is removing all of their physical media this week from their store. It's all very interesting. Let's see if we can go back and I'll help you out and you help me out, try to fill in some of the blanks here, going back to the start of vinyl records and then maybe how it got to the most common application or the most common presentation, which would be a 12-inch LP album by one artist. And then at the same time, in tandem with that would be 7 inches as well. So how far are you willing to go back with this, with the invention of vinyl that you've discovered in some of your research and some of your writings?
Well, I never saw anyone make this point exactly, but certainly you can see from the early days of vinyl until long players, there didn't seem to be any idea that you, wait, let me rephrase that a bit. When vinyl was first being put out, maybe you'd get a 78 that was 10-inch and it would just have one song on each side. And if you wanted to get, I don't know, some popular artists, maybe you'd buy five of their 78s. And no one thought anything of, well, yes, you listen to one and then you put the other on, then you put the other on. No one really thought about how, well, wouldn't it be nice to just have, say, a longer playing format where you could just hear it all in a row? That just wasn't seen as any hindrance. What I think happened, and actually I have read this, was that they were looking for ways to better present music that was in a longer format, especially classical music.
Right.
So that's where you see that divide happening. And certainly when long players came in, that was their advantage. They could have a complete musical movement from a classical symphony, say, symphonic piece on one side, 20 minutes or however much it was. And whereas before in the other format, you'd have to hear it in chunks. And now you can hear it in a longer format. Whereas it wasn't felt as necessary to do that with pop music, popular music. Popular in the broadest sense, not meaning pop rock like we might think of. And I also saw there was kind of a generational divide, especially when 78s were more replaced by 7-inches and 45s, whether that was a 45 or an EP. Those are things that kids were more likely to buy, or younger people. Okay. Whereas adults who maybe had money and had more esoteric tastes, they would want a classical music album or something like, a Nat King Cole or Frank Sinatra.
Sure.
So they present albums for the adult market because they had more money. So you had that kind of thing, economic and generational.
That's really great, and I want to go back to that because that is very astute, and I do want to talk about the difference between 7-inch and 12-inch, and I hadn't really thought about it being kind of just a cooler, cheaper format, the 7 inches. Just going back to classical music, I think there was a mention in the book about somebody even thinking, hey, if we're going to do an entire piece of music or entire movement on vinyl, maybe we should go bigger than 12 inches. And I think there was an experiment that made even bigger. Am I right? Like up to 30 inches, a 30-inch record or something?
No, I don't see how that could be practical.
Yeah, no, I don't either. I'll have to confirm with the book and put it in the show notes. But I'm very, very certain that there was a wild experiment to go even bigger. The funny thing that the book had mentioned is how the landing on 12 inches was just completely random. It was probably just an American saying, well, 12 inches is how we like to measure things, 1 foot. That's so funny. So the 12 inches and the 7 inches are interesting. So back then, I mean, it was kind of a little bit of a competition. Is that not true? There was a little bit of a competition between the two formats before we realized we could have both?
No, I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the history about that. I would think maybe not so much because LPs were more for adults and 7 inches were more for younger people or teenagers. Okay. And I was thinking we were talking about portability. That was sort of the 45 was the one that was portable. Maybe we've all seen pictures of 50s or early 60s at some pajama party or sock hop or something where you'd have a case. You'd have a little case where you could put all your 45s in because that would be easier than a whole bunch of albums. Yeah. And a lot of teenagers probably didn't have them anyway. A teenager, maybe we've all seen this picture of someone in, like a Bobby Soxer in her bedroom, and she has one of those little portable record players that used to open up like a suitcase. Yeah. And it even came some of them came in a sort of a suitcase. You could take those around. Yeah. And then friends would come over and they'd have their cases with the 45s in them that you would play. Yeah. Well, and that is very interesting. I never thought, because I had read that it was maybe RCA who was pushing the 45s and perhaps the 7 inches as well. But and then it was Columbia who thought, no, let's make these bigger.
it was probably whenever they both conceded that there is a world for both of them, because like you mentioned, the kids with the 45, but also jukeboxes, right? Preferred that format.
Yeah. They
Yeah.
didn't. I don't think it's a jukebox. It has an album, and
Yeah.
also, with a single being on an album, that meant the 7-inch was a promotional device for the
Right.
12. So
Right.
they could kind of work in tandem that way.
That's so interesting. I want to ask you, fast forward to now, I mean, the 12-inch LP continues to, like in today, and part of the new kind of revolution, the 12-inch is dominant. It continues to sell crazy amounts of old records from the 60s, 70s, 80s, as well as all of the new stuff that they're doing. But I don't think the same can be said for the 7-inch, maybe in some genres or subcultures. But for a lot of record labels in our communities, people who listen to this show, it's really hard to make 7-inches work financially. There just doesn't seem to be an appetite for them.
I hadn't thought about that. I think maybe some people now, well, I don't know about the cost, but maybe some people, even if they have 3 or 4 songs, maybe they prefer to put them out on a 12-inch, like an EP, because it makes more of an impact. Of course, that's what Sub Pop did in the 80s. A lot of those early records they put out EPs because you would have the impact of the 12-inch cover with the Charles Peterson photograph on it.
Right.
Even though it only had 3 or 4 songs, and which they could have put on a 7-inch, because you could have 4 songs on a 7-inch EP. But yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, certainly I think with punk or an alternative genre, people might be more likely to put out singles that way.
That's where I agree.
Artists I know, it's like they don't even think of putting out a single. They just say, well, let's do an album instead. If they're putting it on vinyl, they won't bother putting out a single. Maybe it's just more cost effective to put an album out.
I think today, just with the amount of effort to get a graphic designer to put something together and to get the music ready and everything, I mean, the price to do 100 or 200 7-inches is not that far off from doing 100 or 200 12-inches. And then I think the biggest issue too is, what is it worth? I mean, maybe there was a time, you can tell me, but maybe there was a time where you could sell these for a few dollars or give them away as promotional items. But if you're sinking $1,000 or more into manufacturing these and you're only doing 100, that means you need to sell them for $10 each, a 1-song thing. It's not very appetizing for fans, I believe.
Yeah.
One of the questions that always interests me is, and we don't have to go back too far to discover this because we can still see it today with Apple and Spotify, but you look back to these formats and the releases, and they came from companies, originally they came from companies who sold the machines. And it was mirrored with Apple, when they had a music store in hopes of selling their iPods, in the same way that Edison wanted to sell his recording machines or his playback machines. It just seems like the roots of some of this industry is rooted in artists and music being used as just a utility, much like they are today for the tech companies. Have you any thoughts on this type? I mean, it seems problematic, and it seems like some of the issues we have today with streaming, taking advantage of artists or not paying artists properly, that there is a history to that.
Yeah. Well, one thing I really dislike about today is the planned obsolescence in all of our devices. If you bought, well, heck, I have a stereo that, I got it last century, and it still works. It still plays, and your devices, after a few years, when you can't update its operating system or whatever, then it might still work, but you can't do new stuff with it.
No, yeah.
So I find that very frustrating. I hate having to buy new computers and new phones all the time. And I guess people are too tied up in that to all say, no, we won't buy them. Because there's some improvements, but others I don't think they need to keep, upgrading an operating system. It used to be only every couple years, and now I think with Apple, it's every year they have a new operating system. So yeah, I dislike that part of it. All right.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Yeah, and it's again, because it's happening so fast and it's such a short time, from when I started, even when I started this podcast or when I started this label, there was CDs still had a little bit of a grasp and we're still selling quite a bit. But then it gets harder and harder to find CD players. And so you have to get used ones. And then same with cassette players and even turntables. It's who's repairing them. And it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think that maybe they would have, what they're doing with our devices now, maybe they would have done that back then, the same thing back then too, if they could. It's just technology wasn't developing as fast. I mean, first you just had, it would be a mono turntable, not turntable, a mono system.
Yeah.
And then stereo was the next big invention, but you could still get a record, your record would still play.
Sure.
The stereo record would still play on your mono device. And then maybe you'd get into more high-end audiophile things, but you could still use a cheaper format if you wanted to.
Yeah. No, and it's amazing. And I don't know anything about how those things work on the inside, but my stereo downstairs is made up of parts from the 90s, 80s, and 70s, and they're playing records from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it is amazing how many other pieces of tech I've gone through in how long those things have been alive and are still kicking, much like furniture as well. Let me ask you about my favorite topic in this whole thing, and that's artwork. I love artwork, and probably one of the main reasons why I love going back to vinyl. And it's the bigger artwork, but it's more than that too. It's even ugly artwork is more fascinating when it's big. And so I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts on if that played a role in the original popularity of records, and perhaps it plays a bigger role in today's recent resurgence.
Well, I don't know if artwork played a role in popularizing albums at all.
Originally?
But yeah, originally.
Okay.
But certainly it became more developed over the years and more sophisticated. And, now you have books, the 100 best album covers of all time, that kind of thing. Yeah. I know when I was, when I was looking into things along that line, I had read that in the 50s, especially when they were putting out albums by Black artists, a lot of times they would put a white person on the cover. And so I started noticing that. It was something I hadn't thought about before, but then once it was pointed out and I'd see, and I remember there was like a Nat King Cole album, I think it was, and you don't see Nat on the cover. There was some white woman, hugging her boyfriend type of thing, or just her man. And so if you go back and look, you'd see that a lot.
I got to find one of those. That's interesting.
More open prejudice of that. Yeah. Kind of similarly in a way to when they would make musical films that might have segments by Black artists. And this might have even happened with some of the rock films where artists would just sort of be presented doing their songs. And because they weren't really part of the narrative, that way you could cut out the Black person's performance if you were showing the film in the South, say. So
crazy.
People don't realize how ingrained that kind of thing was. And they say, that was a while ago. Well, 50s and 60s, that's
not that long
your
ago.
Living memory.
That's that's right. Your grandparents' high school memories. Yeah, that is so bizarre. I mean, that's crazy. And that's interesting that would come into play on artwork. I know that I remember hearing about like the ink spots and how there was like kind of a white equivalent boy band at the time. There was like it was very common to have one song sung by Black artists and then the same song sung by white artists for a different application. Yeah.
Well, you saw that a lot in the 50s where people were Little Richard or Chuck Berry songs.
Right.
White artists, because it was popular and they thought, this could sell.
Yeah.
And, maybe a white person could get on the radio easier than a Black person.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's why you saw Pat Boone covering Little Richard songs, which he said later he didn't really want to do. It was, but his manager and other people said, "You are recording this." So
yeah, that's right. So
at
going
least when
back,
Elvis did that, he had a bit more feeling for those kind of songs because
yeah,
that was his show. But
yeah,
just to talk about artwork again, and I'd have to. I'm not sure if this happened before. Well, I guess they didn't really have albums before the 50s. But I think that seems to be the decade where you start seeing covers that become classic and iconic, like Elvis Presley's first album with it has Elvis Presley down there in like the pink and green, I think it is.
Yeah.
Forming. And that cover's been parodied many times over the years.
Sure.
It's a classic. Or with the Beatles in the next decade, in the 60s, they point to them as being really innovative as far as rock album covers. Because the first one, and I'm talking about the UK covers, because those were the ones that they invested more in.
Okay.
And the first one, they're just looking down over a balcony. It's kind of a typical shot of a pop group. But then for the next one, they really go up a grade, up a level to something a lot more sophisticated. The cover for With the Beatles, which they did use that photo for, Meet the Beatles in this country, where it's very arty, and they're all in shadow, and you just saw their faces. Three, and then Ringo at the bottom, and they're kind of in half shadow too. And that photographer had done a similar shot of jazz musicians in England. He was British, so he just used the same idea for the Beatles, but it was very sophisticated for a rock group. And you could see they would bring that to their future covers. Like Rubber Soul, which I think in England when it came out, I think that cover doesn't have their name on it, which that was considered immensely groundbreaking to not have the art.
Yeah, that's right.
Revolver doesn't have their name either, I guess, because they're so big, you don't need to have the name on the cover. But in the Beatles anthology, they talk about how for Rubber Soul, the photographer had taken pictures, and then he met with them to show them the pictures. And what he did was he had them on slides and was projecting them on a 12 by 12 piece of, white cardboard or something, so they could see what it would look like as an album in, real life. And Paul said that, the cardboard was propped up against the wall, but then it slipped. And so it kind of elongated their faces. And the Beatles just latched onto that and thought, that looks interesting. Can you print it so it looks like that? And so that's why you get that kind of stretched look on that cover, which was just a happy accident. But see, they were fairly sophisticated themselves as far as art, and were interested in art and what was going on in other fields besides just music. And because by then they're, biggest group in the world, they could call the shots as far as this is what we want on our album covers. But then, that goes out there, and then that becomes an influence. People think, oh yeah, I could do something
anything.
like this
too. Yeah. So it's so interesting.
You saw this period where the cover was regarded, it wasn't just the sleeve that you kept the album in so it wouldn't get scratched. It was part of the whole package. Music and the cover and the artwork and what might have been on the back liner notes or whatever.
I guess I take from what you're saying is that there would have been this tipping point at some point in the 60s where the music fan would be under the impression that the album cover came from the creative minds of their artists that they love, as opposed to just some designer at the record label.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly that still happened. There were certainly artists or bands, musicians, performers, where the design department took over. But I think certainly if you had more clout, you could have a say. Yeah. Well, I think of the Monkees for the second album, More of the Monkees. They hated that cover, and they didn't even know an album was coming out. They were on tour, and they thought they would come back and start work on their next album. But Don Kirshner had gone through the vaults and was just put this album together. And it had these pictures from a photo session they'd done modeling clothes for J.C. Penney, which that was okay for the ads.
Yeah.
They were very unhappy it was on an album cover. So
gosh.
I think they Kirshner was out soon after that for a lot of reasons. But artists themselves recognized the importance of that.
I need to do a deep dive because I forgot about that 50s homogenous look of track titles on the front and big names on the front, Johnny Cash and even Blue Note and Elvis Presley, and then into the Beatles and all that they experimented, and then what that did into the 70s with hypnosis and just the kind of the most of the iconic ones that we think of now are from the 70s.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd have to look into this. You mentioned hypnosis, and I'm not sure how much I don't know how much influence Pink Floyd had on the covers, but they chose those designers. They chose the design company of Hypnosis specifically because they had an aesthetic that the band liked. So
Yeah.
I think I have the impression that the designers really came up with the concepts and didn't necessarily work off what the band wanted.
You're
I could
right.
be wrong.
No, I 100%. Well, I'm 90% sure that you're right, and
Yeah.
I think the hypnosis kind of. There's a documentary out on one of the streaming platforms. I need to get it to watch it on hypnosis so I can speak with a little more authority. But I think you're right. I think they kind of became what you were referring to the Beatles as becoming, whereas hypnosis just became iconic at doing album covers, and bands would just go to them and say, "What do you have?" And in some cases, I'm forgetting the gentleman's name who passed away not too long ago, the main designer there. But in some cases, they would open the filing cabinet, pull out an idea, and say, "Here you go," quite literally. Anyway, that's an interesting part of it, but it really does speak to that whole journey of to where we are today with album covers and how important they are. So fun. Let's wrap up, and I want to ask you. We talked about filler. That's good. We've talked about we've hopped all over the place. Just real quickly about record stores and some of the roles that they're playing. Back then, the act of going to the record store to discover a record or to buy it on release day, we don't need that necessarily today to hear if a band has a new album out, whether or not they have a new album out, or to even sample it. Of course, we don't need a record store for that. For me personally, it's about the hunt. I know for a lot of people, and you allude to this a little bit in the book, it's about community. And I know in Larry's book about Record Store Day, the same thing. It was about that kind of celebration of music all together, almost like a church service. So can you talk to me a little bit about the record store, and is the role of the record store today similar at all to how it was in the 70s and 80s?
Well, that's the thing I hadn't thought about that much, but certainly, yeah, you could, if you want a record, you probably go online first to see, oh, where can I get it? But I think the online experience seems to be more like going for a specific thing. I want this album by this artist. And you look for it and maybe see what the different stores are selling it for, and that's it. Whereas you mentioned the hunt, and I think that's what's key to the record store, because maybe you go to the record store to buy a specific album, but then you browse and you don't have that same experience browsing online. I guess you can, but it's not quite the same because online is targeted. You want this specific thing. And for being at the record stores, it's a broader experience. I remember this would be the 80s when we had a Tower Records, and they had the import section was in front. And every time I went there, I would go through each bin to see what they had from the imports. And, I wasn't looking for anything specific. I didn't know what I was going to find, but that's what you did to see what was there and might be available. So certainly for browsing, I think that's what people could use a record store for. What the ones they have here? I mean, one of the best ones they have here where I am in Seattle is Easy Street, and they're always doing in stores, and they also have a little cafe in there.
Oh, cool! So it is about community.
Yeah. And, well, West Seattle is a very community-oriented type of place. So stores are trying to do that. Or there's another store I go to here called Neptune Music, which is subterranean. It's in a basement, and it's just crammed with stuff. It has just about every.
Man.
They have VHS and 8-track tapes. Too small to do an in-store, but I think they just have a devoted clientele. That's a place where you go to browse because it's a used store. So you don't know what you're going to find. A place like Easy Street does have new and used records, so you can expect to find new records there. But others, it's, I don't know, like a treasure hunt, because if you go to a place that is primarily a used record store, you don't even know what they're going to have there. So I guess it would depend these days if people want that kind of experience, because as you say, there's no waiting time, and maybe people just want things faster. And I don't want to spend half an hour looking through records. Yeah. Well, the Record Store Day tried to encourage that kind of mindset. These are the records that they're putting out. Maybe the stores you're at will have them. Maybe they won't. The way to know is to go there and physically look through those bins.
Does the kind of the renewed interest in record stores, the popularity on a Saturday afternoon, does that surprise you?
I don't really remember if it did surprise me or not. I thought, oh, that's a good idea. And then, well, maybe I was a bit surprised because you didn't know is vinyl even popular now. But certainly in the early years, you'd go and there'd be lines outside the stores, or if you'd go in to look, there'd be people crowded around and such, trying to do that. So it did show that there was a kind of, it was fulfilling a need that perhaps others thought wasn't there. Well, it obviously was, because people are going out and they're spending time looking through the bins to buy this stuff. And there would be the popular releases, and you could see the ones that weren't popular because they'd all be left behind. There'd be 5 to 10 copies of, one of the loser albums, and the others were harder to find. Yeah.
Are you, my last question for you, and again, I won't hold you to this. I know it's the most impossible question, but, and I've asked a lot of our people who work in the vinyl world over the past couple of months, the same question. And are you hopeful for the future of vinyl? Are you afraid for the future of vinyl? I mean, when we get the numbers, and I think we'll be getting 2023's numbers in a couple of weeks, will we continue to see this, and this? Will that continue? Will it crash? Will it plateau? I'm asking you to predict the future, please.
Well, I'm not sure. I guess I'd say it would probably plateau.
That's a
lot of other outside things that would weigh into that, like the economic situation in general. Because when times are tight, entertainment is one of the first things that people cut.
Sure.
And maybe as years go by, it might get harder to find the equipment to play it on, the turntable and the receiver and that. You have to spend more money, and so that might make it more difficult. I know someone I talked to at Sub Pop, he thought there'd be a CD revival soon because they're so cheap now. Sometimes that seems, well, here's an interesting thing. When a format goes out of fashion, it becomes really cheap. And that was what happened with vinyl, where you could see records for $1 or $2. Then suddenly it was resurging, and those same albums were selling for a lot more. The $2 album is now a $10 to $15 album.
Easily.
But that didn't happen with 8 tracks. That went out of fashion. They went out of fashion, and they just never came back.
They never came back. I think they were put straight in the landfill. Well, listen, I won't take more of your time. The book is great. All of your books are great. There's so much rich history there that you've covered over the years. So I really do appreciate that work that you've committed to over the years. So thank you for that. And thank you for doing this show.
Well, thanks for having me on your show.